The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Montana like a whispered secret when Bridger Holloway first heard the sound, a high-pitched whinnying that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of dawn itself. He paused mid-step, his weathered hands still gripping the fence post he'd been about to secure, and listened. There it was again, more urgent this time, accompanied by the thundering of small hooves against packed earth. Bridger turned slowly, his 62-year-old frame moving with the deliberate caution of a man who'd learned to read the land's moods. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A young foal no more than a few weeks old was galloping toward him with a desperation that seemed far too mature for its tender age. Its coat was a deep chestnut brown, marked with white patches that caught the early sunlight like scattered stars against a darkening sky. But it wasn't the foal's beauty that stopped Bridger cold. It was the raw panic in its dark eyes, the way its small body trembled with exhaustion even as it continued to run. The little creature stumbled, nearly falling, then righted itself and pressed on with a determination that spoke of something far more serious than mere curiosity or playfulness. "Easy there, little one," Bridger called softly, extending his hand as he'd done countless times with frightened animals. But the foal didn't approach for comfort. Instead, it circled him frantically, whinnying and pawing at the ground, then took several steps back toward the direction it had come from. It looked at Bridger expectantly, as if waiting for something. When Bridger didn't immediately follow, the foal repeated the behavior, circling, calling out, stepping away, looking. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't random behavior, this was communication. The foal was trying to tell him something, trying to lead him somewhere. Bridger had spent 40 years working with horses, and he'd seen intelligence in their eyes that most people dismissed as instinct. But this was different. This young foal, barely old enough to be separated from its mother, was displaying a level of purposeful behavior that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The foal whinnied again, more urgently this time, and began trotting away from him. When it realized Bridger wasn't following, it returned and began the same pattern, circling, calling, retreating, waiting. Its message was clear. Come with me. Now. Against his better judgment, Bridger found himself following. The foal led him, away from his property, across the meadow that bordered his land, and toward a section of wilderness he rarely visited. The little creature moved with surprising endurance for something so young, occasionally looking back to ensure Bridger was still following. As they walked, Bridger noticed details that troubled him. The foal's legs were scratched from brambles, its coat dusty and matted in places. There were traces of dried sweat along its neck, suggesting it had been running for much longer than just the few minutes since he'd first seen it. This wasn't a playful adventure. This was a rescue mission. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Somewhere ahead, likely in distress, was this foal's mother. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as the foal led Bridger deeper into the wilderness. What had started as gentle slopes now became rocky outcroppings and dense thickets of pine and oak. The foal navigated the path with an uncanny sense of direction, never hesitating at crossroads or seeming uncertain about which way to go. Bridger's initial skepticism began to transform into amazement. He'd worked with trained horses that couldn't navigate terrain this complex with such confidence. Yet here was a foal, likely born just weeks ago, moving through the wilderness like it had memorized every stone and branch. "Where are you taking me, little one?" he murmured, more to himself than to the foal. As if in response, the young horse paused and looked back at him with those impossibly expressive dark eyes. For a moment, Bridger felt as though he was looking into the soul of something far older and wiser than its physical form suggested. The foal's pace had been steady, but not rushed until now. Suddenly it began moving faster, its small hooves finding purchase on increasingly treacherous ground. Bridger struggled to keep up, his work boots slipping on loose shale and his breathing becoming labored. The foal would occasionally slow down, as if sensing his difficulty, but its urgency was unmistakable. They had covered nearly a mile when Bridger heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a mare's call, but not the normal whinnying he was accustomed to. This was the sound of an animal in severe distress, weak and desperate. The foal heard it too, and let out an answering call that was heartbreaking in its desperation. The source of the sound was still hidden from view, somewhere beyond a ridge that rose sharply ahead of them. The foal began scrambling up the rocky slope with renewed vigor, small stones cascading down behind it. Bridger followed, his hands grasping at roots and rocky projections to pull himself upward. As they climbed, Bridger began to piece together what must have happened. The mare and foal had likely wandered into this remote area to graze or seek shelter. Something had gone wrong. Perhaps the mare had fallen, or become trapped, or injured herself in some way. The foal, despite its youth, had somehow understood that it needed to find help. But the truly astonishing part wasn't just that the foal had gone for help. It was that it had traveled over a mile through difficult terrain to find a specific human being. Bridger's property was not the closest to this location. There were other ranches, other people who might have been easier to reach. Yet the foal had come to him. The mare's calls were getting stronger now, which Bridger took as a good sign, at EA. At least she was alive and alert. The foal seemed to sense they were close, its movements becoming even more animated. It would run ahead a few steps, then return to ensure Bridger was still following, its behavior becoming increasingly frantic, with proximity to its goal. When they finally crested the ridge, Bridger saw what had driven the young foal to such desperate measures. Below them, in a small ravine partially hidden by fallen timber, was a beautiful paint mare. She was alive and appeared largely uninjured, but she was trapped. A recent storm had brought down several large trees, creating a natural cage around the small depression where she had taken shelter. The logs were too heavy for her to move, and the gaps between them too small for her to squeeze through. The mare saw them and let out a powerful whinny that spoke of relief, desperation, and hope all at once. The foal answered immediately, scrambling down into the ravine through a gap that was just large enough for its small body but far too small for its mother. Bridger stood at the edge of the ravine, assessing the situation with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades solving problems in the wilderness. The mare was trapped, but unharmed, which was fortunate. The fallen timber formed an almost perfect cage around the depression, with no gap large enough for the mare to escape through, yet providing enough space for her to move around and graze on the grass that grew in the protected hollow. The foal had squeezed through the logs and was now pressed against its mother's side, the reunion between them almost overwhelming to witness. The mare nuzzled her offspring with a tenderness that spoke of the profound relief only a mother could feel. Yet even in their reunion, both animals looked up at Bridger with an expectation that was almost human in its clarity. "All right, I see what we're dealing with here," Bridger said aloud, more to organize his own thoughts than to communicate with the horses. He began walking around the perimeter of the natural trap, examining each log, testing their weight and stability. The largest of the fallen trees was a massive oak, easily 3 feet in diameter and weighing several tons. It formed the primary barrier preventing the mare's escape. 2 smaller pines had fallen across it, creating a latticework that was impossible for the mare to navigate. A normal person might have looked at this situation and concluded it was hopeless without heavy machinery. But Bridger Holloway was not a normal person. He was the kind of man who understood leverage and physics through decades of practical application rather than classroom theory. He'd moved boulders with nothing but rope and ingenuity, freed stuck cattle from situations that seemed impossible, and solved problems that others might have given up on. He returned to his truck, thankfully. He'd had the foresight to drive to his property line before walking, and gathered the tools he always carried: rope, a come-along winch, a chainsaw, and various hand tools. The foal watched his preparations with an intensity that was almost unnerving, as if it understood exactly what was happening. Bridger's plan was methodical. He couldn't move the large oak, but he didn't need to. The 2 smaller pines were the key. If he could shift them just enough to create a gap large enough for the mare to pass through, she would be free. The challenge was doing this safely, without causing the entire structure to shift in a way that might injure the trapped mare. He secured his rope around the first pine log, using a technique called a trucker's hitch that would give him mechanical advantage. The come-along winch was attached to a sturdy tree well outside the danger zone. Slowly, carefully, he began to apply tension. The foal seemed to sense that this was a critical moment. It moved away from its mother and found a safe position where it could watch the operation. The mare, as if understanding what was happening, positioned herself as far from the logs as possible, while still staying within the protected area. The first log moved 6 inches, then a foot. The rope strained against the weight, and Bridger could hear the wood creaking under the pressure. But it was working. The gap that had been impossibly small was beginning to widen. Then disaster struck. As the log shifted, it caused one of the other fallen trees to roll, threatening to close off the gap entirely and potentially trap the mare in an even smaller space. Bridger's heart stopped as he watched the situation unfold in what felt like slow motion. The rolling log crashed against another fallen trunk with a sound like thunder, sending a shower of bark and debris into the ravine. For a terrifying moment, Bridger thought his rescue attempt had made the situation worse. The mare whinnied in alarm and pressed herself against the far wall of her natural prison, while the foal scrambled to safety on higher ground. But as the dust settled, Bridger realized that physics had worked in their favor. The rolling log had created a wedge effect, actually opening up a different gap on the opposite side of the ravine. It wasn't the escape route he had planned, but it was an opening nonetheless. The mare seemed to sense the opportunity immediately. She approached the new gap cautiously, testing its width with her muzzle, calculating whether she could fit through. The opening was narrow, perhaps just wide enough, but it was also elevated, requiring her to climb up and over a smaller log that now formed a natural step. Bridger held his breath as the mare attempted her escape. She placed her front hooves on the lower log, testing its stability. The wood held firm. Carefully, she began to work her way up and through the gap, her powerful muscles straining with the effort. For a heart-stopping moment, she seemed stuck. Her shoulders had made it through, but her broader hindquarters appeared too wide for the opening. Bridger was already reaching for his chainsaw, preparing to widen the gap further, when the mare gave a tremendous effort and pushed herself through. She tumbled rather ungracefully down the outer slope of the ravine, but she was free. The foal let out a joyful whinny and scrambled down to rejoin its mother, the two of them nuzzling each other with an emotional intensity that brought unexpected tears to Bridger's eyes. But the story was far from over. As Bridger gathered his tools and prepared for the journey back to his truck, he noticed something that stopped him cold. The mare was limping. Her left rear leg bore weight, but she was clearly favoring it. In the excitement of the rescue, he hadn't noticed the subtle injury that might have been the original reason for her becoming trapped. The mare and foal began following him as he started back toward his property, but their pace was much slower. Now, the mare's limp became more pronounced with each step, and Bridger realized they faced a new problem. The trail back to civilization was over a mile of difficult terrain, manageable for a healthy horse, but potentially impossible for an injured one. The foal seemed to understand the situation as well. It stayed close to its mother, occasionally nuzzling her neck in what appeared to be encouragement. But Bridger could see the worry in the young animal's eyes, the same desperate intelligence that had driven it to seek help in the first place. Bridger pulled out his cell phone, hoping against hope for a signal in this remote location. Nothing. He was too far from any cell tower, surrounded by too much interference from the rocky terrain. His truck was still miles away, and even if he could reach it, the terrain was too rough to drive back to this location. He looked at the mare and foal, both now depending on him for their survival, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible to most people. He was going to have to carry the injured mare out of the wilderness. Not literally, of course, that would be impossible. But he was going to have to find a way to support her weight and help her navigate the difficult terrain ahead. Using techniques he'd learned from decades of working with livestock, Bridger fashioned a makeshift support system, using his rope and some sturdy branches. It wasn't elegant, but it would help distribute the mare's weight and take some of the pressure off her injured leg. The journey back through the wilderness became a testament to the extraordinary bond that can form between humans and animals. In times of crisis, Bridger had improvised a support harness that helped stabilize the mare's injured leg, but every step was still an effort for her. The foal remained constantly at her side, offering what comfort and encouragement a young horse could provide. What should have been a 1-hour hike became a 3-hour odyssey. They moved slowly, taking frequent breaks to allow the mare to rest. During these pauses, Bridger examined her injury more closely. It appeared to be a strained tendon rather than a break, painful and limiting, but not permanently damaging if treated properly. The foal's behavior throughout this journey continued to amaze him. Rather than running ahead or becoming distracted, as young animals typically do, it seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. It would scout ahead for the easiest path, then return to guide them around obstacles. When the terrain became particularly challenging, the foal would find alternative routes that were gentler on its mother's injured leg. As they slowly made their way back toward Bridger's property, he found himself talking to both horses, explaining what he was doing and offering reassurance. While he knew they couldn't understand his words, something in his tone seemed to calm them. The mare began to trust his guidance completely, allowing him to support her weight when necessary, and following his lead without resistance. The sun was high overhead by the time they reached the edge of Bridger's property. The familiar sight of his red barn and white farmhouse had never looked so welcoming. But their challenges weren't over yet. The mare needed veterinary attention, and Bridger needed to make arrangements for both horses' long-term care. The foal had never been separated from its mother, and both animals were clearly wild, unaccustomed to human handling beyond this emergency situation. Yet they had formed a bond with Bridger that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. They trusted him in a way that spoke to something deeper than mere gratitude. Bridger led them to a small paddock near his barn, one that was secure but spacious enough to give them room to move around. He provided fresh water and hay, watching as both horses ate hungrily. It was clear they had been trapped for several days at least, surviving on whatever vegetation was available in their prison. While the horses rested and fed, Bridger called Dr. Maverick Stone, the local veterinarian, who had been treating animals in the valley for nearly as long as Bridger had been ranching. The call was brief but urgent, and Dr. Stone promised to come out immediately. As they waited for the veterinarian, Bridger sat on the fence rail watching the mare and foal. The young horse had not left its mother's side except to drink water, and even then it kept one eye on her constantly. Their bond was extraordinary, but it was their collective trust in him that truly took his breath away. The mare approached the fence where he sat, and for the first time since their initial meeting, she allowed him to touch her. Her muzzle was soft against his palm, and her dark eyes held an expression of gratitude that was unmistakably intelligent. The foal came closer too, less cautious now, and allowed Bridger to stroke its neck. In that moment, sitting in the afternoon sun with two wild horses who had chosen to trust him, Bridger felt something shift in his understanding of the world. These animals had demonstrated intelligence, loyalty, and communication skills that challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundary between human and animal consciousness. Dr. Stone arrived within the hour, his weathered pickup truck kicking up dust as it pulled into Bridger's driveway. The veterinarian was a man of few words but infinite competence, and he examined the mare with gentle efficiency, while Bridger held her steady. The foal watched every movement with intense scrutiny, as if evaluating whether this new human could be trusted. "Strained tendon like you thought," Dr. Stone confirmed after his examination. "Nothing torn, nothing broken. She'll need rest and anti-inflammatory treatment, but she'll make a full recovery. Give it about 6 weeks, and she'll be good as new." The relief Bridger felt was profound, but it was nothing compared to what he saw in the foal's eyes. Somehow, the young horse seemed to understand that the news was good. Its posture relaxed for the first time since their initial meeting, and it moved closer to its mother with a contentment that was beautiful to witness. As Dr. Stone prepared the medication and discussed treatment protocols, He asked the question Bridger had been dreading. What are you planning to do with them? They're clearly wild horses, probably from the herd that roams the national forest. Legally, you'll need to contact the Bureau of Land Management. Bridger had been thinking about this exact issue all day. Wild horses on public land were federally protected, and there were specific procedures for dealing with situations like this. But as he watched the mare and Foal, both of whom had chosen to trust him in their moment of greatest need, he couldn't bear the thought of them being processed through the typical bureaucratic channels. I was thinking, Bridger said carefully, that maybe there's another option. I've got plenty of grazing land, good water sources, and these two seem to have decided they like it here. What if I applied to adopt them through the BLM's adoption program? Dr. Stone looked at him with surprise, then smiled slowly. You know, that might just work, especially given the circumstances of how you found them. Or rather, how they found you. The adoption process took several weeks, but it was successful. The Bureau of Land Management was impressed by the story of the foal's remarkable journey to seek help and agreed that Bridger's ranch would provide an ideal home for both horses. The paperwork was extensive, but Bridger navigated it with the same methodical patience he'd used to free the mare from her natural prison. During the mare's recovery period, both horses settled into life on the ranch with surprising ease. The foal, whom Bridger eventually named Journey, grew rapidly and developed into a stunning young horse with an intelligence that continued to astound everyone who met him. The mare, whom he called Hope, recovered completely from her injury and became the gentle matriarch of Bridger's small herd. What happened next was perhaps the most astonishing development of all. Both horses began to demonstrate an almost supernatural ability to sense when other animals were in distress. On 3 separate occasions over the following months, Journey led Bridger to animals that needed help, a calf stuck in a ravine, an injured deer, and even a lost dog that had been missing for days. Word of the remarkable horses spread throughout the valley. Bridger began receiving calls from other ranchers asking for his help in locating missing livestock. Journey seemed to have an uncanny ability to track animals in distress, while Hope provided a calming presence that helped facilitate rescues. 2 years later, Bridger's ranch had become an unofficial wildlife rescue operation. He had partnered with local veterinarians and animal control officers to provide a service that was unique in the region. Journey, now a magnificent young stallion, had earned a reputation as the most remarkable animal tracker anyone had ever seen. But for Bridger, the most rewarding aspect wasn't the recognition or the satisfaction of helping other animals. It was the quiet moments in the evening when he would sit by the paddock fence, watching Hope and Journey, grazing peacefully in the setting sun. The foal who had traveled over a mile through difficult terrain to plead for help had not only saved his mother, he had transformed Bridger's life and the lives of countless other animals. The bond between them remained as strong as ever, built on trust, mutual respect, and the shared memory of that extraordinary day when a desperate young foal had somehow known exactly who to ask for help. It was a reminder that intelligence, loyalty, and love exist in forms far beyond human understanding, and that sometimes the most profound connections happen when we least expect them. In the quiet of those Montana evenings, Bridger often reflected on how a simple morning of fence repair had led to the most meaningful relationship of his life. The foal's plea for help had been answered, but in the process, Journey and Hope had answered something in Bridger's heart that he hadn't even known was missing. The result was indeed astonishing. Not just the successful rescue, but the lifelong partnership that grew from it. 3 souls who had found each other in a moment of crisis had created something beautiful, something that would continue to help others for years to come. And it all began with a young foal who refused to give up, who traveled over a mile to find exactly the right person to save his mother. That was the true miracle. Not just the rescue, but the recognition that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, and that the bonds we form in our darkest moments can illuminate the rest of our lives.